My name's Alexander Ayling. If you're new here, I am a dual citizen of the United States and New Zealand. My dad is born and raised in New Zealand. I was born and raised in the United States, but grew up visiting family here. And in 2021, January of 2021, I moved to New Zealand with my wife. And in February of this year, 2024, my wife and I had our first child, our daughter, Eliana. In this video, I'm gonna be sharing some of the things that I've learned coming from an American perspective about New Zealand and kind of comparing and contrasting the biggest differences between life in the USA and life in New Zealand. If you're a new viewer, I'm just gonna give a quick recap. 4 years ago, my wife and I moved to New Zealand. We traveled the country and eventually found a old 1940s homestead in the countryside of New Zealand. We bought it and we've spent the last few years DIY renovating this property. So if you want to see more about that, there's a playlist on my channel. Make sure you subscribe if you're new here. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and drop a comment with your thoughts or questions down in the comment section. Okay, let's get into it. One of the first things that I noticed moving here from America, living in Southern California, and definitely being a part of that American work hustle culture in my 20s, was the difference in the work-life balance in New Zealand. When we moved to the town that we live in, it's a small rural town. We were driving down the street on a Friday night at 4:45 p.m. and all the shops were closing up or closed. They closed at 5 p.m. Very few businesses were open past that, other than a couple of, fast food American businesses like McDonald's or Burger King, and a couple of restaurants. And at first I remember going, wow, this is insane. Like, I can't believe everything's closed on a Friday night. But then I realized, who really wants to be working on a Friday night? Very few people. Most people would probably be home with their families and spending time with people they care about. That was kind of a revolutionary moment for me, and an understanding of, oh, there is a much different work-life balance in this country, and one that definitely leans towards benefiting the individual versus benefiting the corporation or the employer. And that work-life balance approach is evident across society, across New Zealand culture. In 2023, the platform Remote, which does a ranking of 60 high GDP countries around the world for work-life balance, found that New Zealand had the best score, 80 out of 100, for work-life balance. New Zealand also has a particularly high minimum wage and generous annual leave. Very rarely do people lead with that awkward American question when you first meet somebody. What do you do for a living?
For work, what do you do?
Wait, but what do you do for work?
It does come up, but not as often. And if it does come up, it's way down the conversation list. I think that Kiwis work to live versus live to work. Number 2, societies do exist where people with different opinions can coexist peacefully. It might seem hard to believe in this day and age with the state of the world, the state of politics, but New Zealand, I believe, has a really healthy approach to it. They don't talk politics all the time. Very rarely has anything political ever really come up in conversation with my Kiwi friends. When you go to a dinner party, it's not like, let's talk about the most awkward and potentially divisive thing we can. Where I feel like many times in the USA, especially nowadays, politics comes up, it rears its ugly little head everywhere, and it drives wedges between friendships and families, especially in the current climate. So I really like how New Zealand approaches politics. New Zealand is a fully functioning, stable democracy. It's got multi-party system. So, there's not just the two options, the two-party system like in the USA. There's multiple different parties that encompass many different diverse beliefs, and it's a parliamentary system. But, politics and elections are pretty mellow down here. And I really think that that is a great approach to inclusive, peaceful democracy. Everybody's entitled to their own beliefs. There's a level of freedom here I feel rivals anywhere else I've ever been in the world. Now, that being said, people are a lot more respectful of each other and each other's individual rights. But at the same time, there's an expectation of kind of being a good member of society. And I think that that balance is really nice. It encourages people to be good, upright citizens and to kind of take care of the common good, the commonwealth of the country. That I feel is something that is kind of lacking over in the USA. There's a focus on individual rights over everything, whereas I think New Zealand has a much more nuanced approach to that. Obviously, individual rights are important and people can do what they want as long as they're not breaking the law. At the same time, there's also a feeling of like being a member of a community, being a member of society, and doing your best to make sure that you're not like harming anybody or being a nuisance. I don't know. That's kind of what I've gathered from here, especially in the political scene. The last election in New Zealand was in October of 2023, October 14th, 2023. I voted in that election and it was very interesting. There was a peaceful transition of power. The incumbent party was voted out, which seems to be a trend across the world right now. People were pretty relaxed about it. And even if you have different political beliefs, people don't really make that something bigger than it is. Number three, the next thing that I think is a really big difference between New Zealand and the USA is that people in this country lead with trust. Interpersonal interactions are based off of a base level of trust, which is much higher than in the USA. Now, obviously, New Zealand has a much smaller population than the United States. There's only 5 million people who live in New Zealand. The landmass of New Zealand between the 3 main islands is about the same amount of land as the state of Oregon. When you extrapolate numbers, 5 million people is a lot smaller than 336 or more million people who live in the USA. When you have more people, you have more bad apples. But generally, the harvest of apples here in New Zealand is pretty good, both for the trees and for the people. I think that Kiwis lead with a base level of trusting you, trusting in the inherent good in people. And when you do that as a society, the effects of that ripple out far and wide and make society feel better, just better vibes between people. Interpersonal relationships improve. I can't tell you how many people I've met in the last few years living down here who have been so trusting and so kind and so giving. And I think that that has really impacted me and made me be the same. For example, when we purchased this house and we closed on it, we shook hands with the real estate agent and he's like, right, well, we'll see you later. And he starts leaving and I'm like, wait, what about the keys? And he goes, oh, there are no keys. And I'm like, what? And he goes, yeah, there's no keys because the owner hasn't locked this house in the last 15 years. And I said, wow, that's really beautiful, but like, also, having just bought this place, I would really like the keys because there are locks on the doors. So obviously we got new keys and got the locks changed, whatever, but people are pretty trusting and relaxed, and it's really nice to live in a place that feels like that. I don't think that that's the case in the States. And like I said, there's a bigger population and larger gaps. I think that it's worth mentioning that New Zealand is a more equitable society. There's less extremes of wealth and poverty. I don't know. I don't have the answers to all of these larger socioeconomic questions, but these are just my observations. And living in a place where people lead with trust, it is really nice. And I should just say that Kiwis are friendly, hospitable, and inclusive. So that's awesome. And that kind of just rolls into the next one, which is New Zealand has a great sense of community. Even though we live in the countryside, we are really close with a lot of our neighbors. people are so kind, so giving with their time, with their expertise, with so many things. I can't tell you how many times my wife and I have just been blown away by how friendly people are here and how kind and giving they are, especially with time. Kiwis don't feel rushed. There is a approach to time that's very laid back, coming from the USA where it's go, go, go all the time and you can't be late, you gotta go now, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. There's a stress and anxiety that pervades life in the USA that is really not as apparent here in New Zealand. There's a lot of phrases, one of which is she'll be right, which just means like it's all good. People are way more laid back. Yeah, life moves fast enough. There's no need to make it go faster. And that also leads to a feeling of community. We have a great group of neighbors, have barbecues and dinner parties and play groups with the kids, and all of these things are more reasons that we really love being down here. And I will just say, we lived in a bunch of different places in LA, and even when we were living in the suburbs of LA, we had a ton of neighbors. We only really had good relations with one of our neighbors, and literally the neighbors who we shared a fence with. I don't know what their deal was, but like we went over there and knocked on their door when we first moved in and like wanted to introduce ourselves. They didn't answer, and for the 2 years that we lived there, they kind of like just avoided us and we never actually met them. It was weird, and it's nice to be able to know your neighbors, have good relations with your neighbors, and have a sense of community. Number 5, New Zealand is the land of DIY. The do-it-yourself mentality is very strong here in New Zealand. And I think it's probably due to a number of different factors, but I will say that people are quite capable down here, especially in the countryside, but all across New Zealand, there is a culture of do-it-yourself, of learning how to do things if you don't know how to do them. And it kind of goes back to the original thing where I was saying that people are really giving with their time. Every single step along the way of renovating this property, I've hired people originally to kind of help with larger jobs. And during that process, all of those people were super helpful, totally fine with me kind of shadowing and teaching me how to do the things that they were doing. And through that, I've learned to become much more competent. So the DIY mentality is really strong in New Zealand. And businesses like TaskRabbit, for example, in the USA, where you can hire a handyman to come and do things in your house. And there's a bunch of different handymen who are on an app and you're like, okay, I'll pick this one. That's convenient, but at the same time, I feel like it leaves people feeling incapable of doing fairly straightforward things. And I don't know if that goes back to that work-life balance. At least for me, when I was living in the States, I was always focused on working and thinking like, my time's better spent doing this task on the computer and making money, and then I'll just pay somebody to do something as simple as like hanging some decorations around the house. Whereas here, that is not the case. Hey, you can do it. Here's how you do it, and go for it. Through moving to New Zealand, through renovating this house and learning how to take care of the land and growing food and canning and harvesting and all of these things have helped make me a more rounded, well-rounded individual and a much more competent, confident person. So the DIY culture here in New Zealand is strong. And then number 6, people lead with kindness. There is a universal approach to interactions between people in New Zealand society that leads with kindness. People are nice. Even your daily interactions in town, in the city, if you're running errands, it's very rare that you're gonna get into an argument with a person in a parking lot at the grocery store. Road rage incidents are rare. And yeah, I think that, you know, people in New Zealand are just not as quick to anger, not as quick to confrontation. And that is definitely something that I have noticed while living here compared to back in the United States. People are just nicer, and that is a wonderful thing. Living in a place where people are nice to each other is great, and I can't overstate how important that is, especially being a new father, raising a child. Living in a country where people lead with kindness is priceless. And it's also something that is kind of reiterated in New Zealand society, in the media, even in politics. People lead with kindness first, and they can have disagreements, but they do it in a respectful way. Instead of like belittling others or, you know, making fun of them or whatever, if they have a disagreement, they can do it in a much more kind way. So that, I think, is really important, especially nowadays. And then finally, number 7 is childhood care. This is a huge, huge difference between the USA and New Zealand. In New Zealand, childcare is covered. Your taxes go towards maternity care. My wife, she was pregnant from the moment of conception until 6 months after birth. She had a midwife. This was all covered by the healthcare system. There is a public healthcare system here in New Zealand, and while some people say that it could be improved, and of course there's ways to improve anything, in our experience it's been pretty good. There's also private healthcare. If you need to do something faster or whatever, you can get private healthcare here, but the public healthcare, maternity care, was covered by that. And from the moment my wife found out she was pregnant, she got a midwife. From that, we would have regular meetings with the midwife at her house. She had a little office in the back, and we would visit, I think, like once every 2 weeks for the first 6 months of the pregnancy, and then towards the end it was more regular. After my wife gave birth to our daughter Eliana, the midwife would come to our house, which is, you know, like 20 minutes outside of town, and she would have regular checkups, just monitoring the baby's health and giving any advice that we would need, or medicine or tips or whatever. That was all covered. And not only that, there's maternity leave and paternity leave. You are working for an employer. Right here on the business.gov website, it says employees may be entitled to up to 26 weeks of government-funded parental leave payments, and they're also entitled to unpaid parental leave for either 52 weeks or 26 weeks, depending on how long they've worked for you. There's really great incentives to become a parent here. I know stories that I've heard, and looking into it, it's not the case in the USA. It can be quite expensive to have a baby, especially if you don't have health care. And there's no law stating that your employer needs to cover you for parental leave. I think that that's also a reason why a lot of people in my generation, the millennial generation, and then also in Gen Z, are really questioning whether or not they can have children, which is super sad, because having a baby, having a child, has been one of the most transformational and rewarding experiences of my life. I know that our baby's only 8 months old, but we're so just smitten and in love, and it's opened my heart so much, taught me so much, and I'm so glad that we decided to have a baby here in New Zealand especially, but just in general. There's a lot of things that New Zealand does very well with maternity care, and I think it's something that the rest of the world should be looking at and trying to emulate. A lot of Kiwis go overseas in their 20s, and they'll either go to Australia or the UK or Canada or sometimes the States. Those first 3 countries, they have a good kind of international visa exchange, so it's easy for Kiwis to go over to Canada or to go to the UK or to go to Australia. And so they do. But oftentimes they end up coming back to have a family. And I think that that's because the maternity care is so great here. And also New Zealand is just a fantastic place to raise a family, because it's consistently ranks as one of the safest countries in the world. Currently, I think it's ranked as the number 2 safest country in the world after Iceland. You know, raising a kid here in New Zealand is really wonderful. Such great access to nature. It's a more slow, laid-back lifestyle, and when raising children, I think that there's a huge benefit to slowing down and engaging more with your child instead of kind of being distracted or stressed or anxious. I guess there are a lot more differences between New Zealand and the USA. I actually made a video about this, but with different comparisons previously. So if you want to watch more, if you're interested in learning more about the differences between the USA and New Zealand, you can check that video out. I'll link it in the description. If you have any other questions, if you'd like me to make another follow-up video to this, then please just drop those down in the comment section. And if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you're curious about coming to New Zealand, traveling here, I have a whole host of great videos about traveling to New Zealand, itineraries for the whole country, a 2-week itinerary, a 3-week itinerary, lots of different travel tips. So check those videos out. I'll link those down in the description as well, or in the cards here. Okay friends, well, I hope you enjoyed that video. Sending love to everybody out there watching, and we'll see you in the next video.